here's what I'm going to tell you and talk about today. I'm going to talk about the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug Act. And the reason I'm talking about them is they really changed the whole scope of how the pharmaceutical industry works. And I was in the industry during these changes, so I can talk about them. So one of the things I'm going to cover today is how these amendments indirectly made patents mandatory for FDA approval, created a big pharma cartel with questionable ethics. And if you don't know what those questionable ethics are, I invite you to go to John Abramson's talk. He was on the panel with me on Sunday. He's written about that. And I think there's been other speakers who have talked about that too. So I'm not going to explain what those questionable ethics are. I think you've been hearing a lot about them. But it did shift our medical paradigm from prevention to treatment, which I know a lot of you are very unhappy about, as I am, and shaved 5 to 10 years off all of our lives. I'll show you how I've calculated that. I have to start with talking about pharmaceuticals and their contribution before I can move on to talking about the lifestyle changes and nutrients and things of this nature, because you'll understand that part better if I start with the pharmaceuticals. So bear with me. Also, I'm going to talk about how to reverse the changes, because if we know how the problem was created, that gives us the power to change it. So that's why I'm going into some detail today. Please bear with me. So first of all, drug companies, most drug companies are started by doctors that had a good idea about what to do. And I'm going to talk about the Upjohn company. That's the company I was with, and the one that was actually involved in fighting these amendments. So William Upjohn created what he called the friable pill. Back in the late 1800s, a lot of the drugs that were in little pills passed right through the digestive system without releasing their nutrients or their drugs, because they didn't know how to make pills that would release the contents at a good rate. So Upjohn solved that problem by having the friable pill. And I have a little graphic here to show you. And he also developed a system to uniformly manufacture these pills, because obviously you need to have the right amount, the same amount in every pill. And so that was his contribution. And of course, when I joined in about 1976, the company was a medium-sized company. But let me get back to the amendments. They were put into place because of a dangerous drug called thalidomide. Dangerous to some people, but not others. We're going to get into that a little bit too. So thalidomide was mostly in Europe. It was put on the market as a safer alternative to barbiturates. And as you know, a lot of people died from barbiturates during the 50s and 60s. And when women took the thalidomide, they found it helped their morning sickness, so they started taking it. But unfortunately, thalidomide was not safe for babies. So if they took it in the first trimester of their pregnancy, the babies were born with lost limbs, or they died in utero, or they died quickly after their birth. And that, of course, was very bad. Now and why did this happen? Well, in the 60s, even though there was some evidence that young babies, fetuses basically, were very sensitive to drugs that the mother took. It was not widely appreciated. So the drug company did not think about that before they started advertising it for morning sickness. And it was usually used in Europe because in the US, the FDA had stopped and refused to have it approved, not because of this situation with the babies, because they didn't know it then, but because it had another side effect, which was peripheral neuropathy, which basically means the nerves in your extremities, right? That something was wrong. So the FDA did have the power to stop drugs they felt were unsafe. I want to make that very clear to you. These amendments were not needed for that. Anyhow, because in Europe they were having all these problems eventually with the babies, Congress felt it should try to pass some law to make sure that the American people felt safe. So they went to these Kefauver amendments that had been languishing in Congress for 3 years. And these had nothing to do with safety. They were designed to give people confidence in generic drugs, which at that point in time were not very popular because some generic drugs, some drugs in general, you have to be confident in the amount you were getting and how well it was absorbed. And if you weren't, the drug didn't work for you. In fact, in some diseases, you could die if that drug wasn't released properly. And we hadn't figured out how to make generic drugs equivalent to what we call branded drugs. So this was a problem, and Kiefer thought that the way to fix it was to demand that generic companies do these very elaborate comparisons of their drugs to the branded drug so that people would buy them with confidence. So they have little to do with safety. But Harris joined Kiefer in this effort, and the result was the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments. And they really were incredibly powerful for the FDA. The FDA then had almost unlimited power over pharmaceutical development. Prior to the passage of these amendments, companies only needed to show that the drug was safe for the intended use. But after these amendments were passed, the FDA could demand exactly which animal studies needed to be done before the drug could be tested in humans, exactly how the human studies needed to be done to show safety and effectiveness, what advertising and labeling was permissible, and they even got so deep into the manufacturing practices that they required, for example, the person who was overseeing the manufacturing to have certain degrees, college degrees. And we didn't have at Upjohn at the time, when these were implemented, we had really great people running our manufacturing, but they did not always have college degrees, and we had to move them to another job because of these requirements. And very detailed records were required. Of course, we always had records, but this was, in many cases, overkill, and it really made it hard, especially on the smaller manufacturers. And also, maybe this was the biggest change in terms of what happened after the amendments were passed. Somebody in the FDA had to actually sign their name on the letter of approval. So somebody had to put their neck in the noose, so to speak, and of course, all drugs have side effects, right? So when a side effect came to the attention of Congress, this person would be on the hot seat. And this wasn't true before the amendments. Before the amendments, the manufacturer would send their data to the FDA. The FDA would look it over, and if the FDA didn't have any objections in 6 months, the company could start selling the drug in the 7th month. So nobody was putting their neck in the noose before these amendments passed. So this really changed the way the FDA dealt with the pharmaceutical companies, because of course, if anything went wrong, the FDA would be called on the carpet to Congress. Now, the other thing you have to realize about these amendments, and you'll see it when I show you the data, it's really living law. It's not just fixed. It grows every year, and it continues to what I call metastasize. And I say that because, as you'll see, all of this has had very negative consequences, even though the intent, of course, was to make drugs safer and more effective. And unfortunately, that is not what happened. And that's the data I'm going to share with you today. So how is effectiveness shown in the time before the amendments? Well, before the amendments, what drug companies would do when they had the drug to a place where they really thought it was ready for human testing, they would give samples to physicians whose word they trusted and say, please give this to the patients that you think need this or could benefit from it, and tell us, does it work or not? And the physicians would do that. And of course, the companies didn't want to sell something that didn't work because their reputation was very important, much more important than it was today. People would buy a drug from a company because they trusted that company. Today, basically, we don't think like that because we have these FDA approvals that we trust so much. And that's a problem because reputation should count. but I won't go into any more of that at this time. Okay, so after the amendments, there were a lot of drugs in the market, right, that hadn't gone through any rigorous effectiveness testing. And so what happened was the FDA asked the National Science Foundation to look at all the available literature and how doctors prescribed and decide if a drug was effective and to put it into different categories. Now, basically, before the amendments, if doctors didn't like the drug, they just didn't prescribe it. So the marketplace pretty much had taken out ineffective drugs. And this was shown when the National Science Foundation really only found a few percentage. I think it was 7, some people say 10%, depending how the data looks to you, as ineffective. There were other categories like possibly effective and things of that nature, but there were very few drugs that weren't good for anything. So the National Science Foundation added their own category as ineffective as a fixed combination. And this was a very controversial category. A lot of doctors really liked the fact that in some cases, like in antibiotics, they could have 2 drugs in 1 pill. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but there's a downside to that too. But at that point in time, about 40% of the top 200 drugs were in these fixed combinations. Now, if you have 2 drugs in a pill, you're probably going to have more side effects, or at least you might expect you would. That's bad. But the good news is that if someone has to take 2 drugs instead of 1, they may miss a pill on one of them, or they don't like taking that many pills, so they weren't as compliant. In other words, patients did not take their drugs as they should when they had 2 pills to take instead of 1. And also, by having the combination, the drug was a lot less expensive. And back in these days, we did not have, and really, in many ways, did not need insurance for healthcare and drugs. And that's a whole nother topic that I won't be able to get into today. But of course, you can feel free to ask questions about it if you want. It's not part of this talk. So there were some advantages. And actually, one of the biggest advantages, especially for antibiotics, was the combination could save a patient's life more effectively, oftentimes, than giving a single antibiotic. And the reason that is back in those days, we did not have the ability to do rapid testing and find out exactly what bacteria was in the person and which antibiotics it might be resistant to. So if you had to wait and give the patient a drug and wait a week to see if it had an effect, by the time you went, oops, I gave them the wrong one, and then you give them the second one, that person might have been so weakened by the week that they waited that, they didn't make it. Also, giving the 2 antibiotics instead of 1 decreased the chance that the person would become resistant to antibiotics. And of course, today, that's a real problem. In fact, it was already a problem starting in those days. So hospitals were routinely giving 2 antibiotics to make sure that they did not have resistance developing in their hospital. So after these amendments were passed, the FDA looked at the National Science Foundation, which wanted to take basically all of these compounds off the market, all of these fixed combinations, almost all of them. I think they left 1 or 2 on the market. And Upjohn sued. It had Pan-Elba, which was a combination of tetracycline and novabiocin. And it accounted for about 13% of Upjohn's sales. So of course, it was, that was a big blow to overnight be told they couldn't market this compound. So they sued for an evidentiary hearing. They wanted to present their evidence that this was a good thing. FDA refused to listen to them. And that's why Upjohn sued. And the FDA said, we are not going to look at this unless you provide us evidence of effectiveness. And Upjohn argued, well, we've been selling it for 13 years. You never had any objection. It's a very widespread use. The doctors love it. That should show you that we have some evidence of effectiveness. And the FDA said, no, we don't we don't believe in that, even though they had just told the National Science Foundation to consider that as evidence for effectiveness. So here the FDA was not being ethical in the way they treated the situation. So Upjohn argued that I should back up a minute. So then the FDA responded by saying, okay, here's what you have to provide us, Upjohn, if you want to keep these drugs on the market. And it was a lot of work because, as we'll see in a minute, it was very elaborate human trials that the FDA wanted. And FDA said, okay, well, we're willing to do that, but we need to have a little time to do it. And the FDA said, no, we're not going to give you that time. The courts agreed with the FDA, so they didn't have any time to produce those studies, and Pan-Elbow was taken off the market. So there were other companies suing as well. I can't get into that for time reasons, but the courts eventually ruled that no more drug companies could sue the FDA because the FDA had weird requirements or decided to accept the data of one company and not the other. And so really the companies had no recourse anymore. And they really felt betrayed because the FDA had not been consistent. It allowed what the doctors prescribed or medical practice to keep some drugs on the market, but not others, even though the drugs were similar. And the companies didn't have the time to meet the new regulations. They couldn't sue the FDA if the FDA favored one company over another. So not surprisingly, the FDA started taking bribes to favor one company over the other. And this was this was especially true in the generic with generic drugs, which the FDA for some reason did not like. So they actually basically took whatever bribes they felt they could get away with in that part of the industry. And eventually one of the generic companies, Bar Laboratories, sued on the grounds that this was a criminal offense, not a regulatory offense, and so that they should be held accountable. But the courts didn't punish the agency, even though they agreed that the FDA had been taking bribes. So you can imagine that the drug companies did not feel very good about this whole situation. And that really changed the way they operated. And I think on this slide, you probably heard of some of this before. The companies actually needed to befriend the FDA because if they didn't, the FDA could arbitrarily destroy the products or not approve any new ones. And so even though it was mostly doctors and scientists that had been running the drug companies, that shifted. It shifted because a lot of the companies decided they had to fight fire with fire. And if, scientists tended to be, well, scientists, they were involved with the data and the possibility of helping people and not necessarily the bottom line. And so the MBAs started taking over. And I remember this well from my years at Upjohn because we were told, actually, that we couldn't develop any more drugs without patents. And the reason that we were told that is because, as I'll show you in a minute, the cost of getting the FDA approval really soared after these amendments. And that was sad because we had developed drugs without patents before because the cost of an FDA approval wasn't huge. But as it grew, of course, it meant that we had to have patents because there was no way, excuse me, there was no way to recover the cost of the FDA approval without some type of monopoly, which of course I don't support that idea, but the regulations made it that the companies either had to have patents or they would not be able to recover their costs. So the MBAs started coming in and their focus was on the bottom line, not on the science. And I saw this gradually happening over my time at Upjohn. It got more and more, the company got more and more managed rather than focused on research. And the revolving door that many of you have heard about with the FDA began right after the amendments. I mean, yes, before the amendments from 59 to 1963, about 10% of the FDA employees would move over to industry. But that was, that's about what you would expect in this type of environment. But by 1969, that number was 72%. 72% of the people who left the FDA went to industry. And the reason they did is the new regulations were extremely confusing. And the companies felt like, we're not going to be able to meet these regulations unless we have somebody who actually can interact with the FDA and knows them and can kind of guide us in how we're supposed to do this stuff. So this was really a reaction to all of these court cases and the things that evolved from the amendments. Now let's talk a little bit about effectiveness, because as I said before, what happened before the amendments is effectiveness was something that was kind of done in a way that today we might find to be not scientific. Although I have to say, when you hear what happened, you'll question that. Let me get a little bit of a drink here. So in 1911, the Supreme Court of the US had decided that effectiveness was an expression of opinion. And there's a good reason for that. There is no such thing as a drug that works for everyone, at least not that I'm aware of. Some people, just because of genetics or environment or whatever, the drug doesn't work. So if a drug company says a drug works, they're not really saying it works for everyone. They can't. It doesn't. It doesn't happen. So the FDA created a rule about what it would consider to be an effective drug. So it required 2 US placebo-controlled studies with a p-value, I'll explain that in a minute, a p-value of 0.05. If you could add, then if you had that, then when your drug was approved, you could advertise that it worked. Now, what does that mean, the p less than 0.05? Well, it means that if you're doing a study and you see that more people were helped by the drug, you do some statistics, and if the p-value is less than 0.05, what it means is that there's a 95% chance that this drug actually works. 95% out of 100, right? So it's a very high standard, especially when you have to do 2 studies. And what's interesting is that our science isn't good enough to really make that standard work. And let me give you an example. So a drug that saves 2 out of 10 lives would not meet the standard. It would not be statistically significant in almost every case. But a drug that lowered blood pressure by 2 millimeters or 2 points, if you want to think of it that way, would be statistically significant. It could get FDA approval, but it's also what we call clinically insignificant. In other words, if you lower your blood pressure by 2 millimeters, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. So this is the problem. Our science isn't good enough to design studies that are actually going to give us the information that most people believe that you get out of these clinical studies. So, if it does meet that standard, it's probably a pretty good drug. But if it doesn't meet that standard, that does not necessarily mean that it's not helping people, as you can see from the examples I just gave. And effectiveness studies are very costly, the most costly part of drug development. And when studies were done after the amendments were passed, about 10 years after the amendments were passed, they compared how effective these studies had been, the post-amendment process had been versus the pre-amendment process. And what they found is there was very, very little difference, if any. So even though when we think of doctors getting pills from the drug companies, using them and reporting back to the company that the drug was effective or ineffective, we don't think of that as a very good process. In fact, it was just as good as this very fancy process primarily because we don't have the science yet to design these studies that the FDA is requiring to make them pick up a lot of drugs that actually work. And in fact, the NIH realized this about 15 years ago and said they were going to go back in the old cancer studies and try to pick out the drugs that saved the 2 out of 10 lives. I never heard anything after they said that, so I don't know if they actually did that. But, you know, it's recognized. This is a recognized thing. Okay, let me get into some details about what happens with these drugs. Okay, so, and how long it takes to get a drug to market. So on this axis, you see the years of development. This is the time after the company decides it wants to market the drug that it takes to get it from the lab bench to the marketplace. And as you can see here, in 1948 to 1961, the years before the amendments, it pretty much took about 4 years. On average, there were a lot, drugs that were longer, some that were shorter. 4 years was the average. Okay, but after the amendments were passed, look how much it increased. It got up to 14 years instead of 4 years. In other words, 10 years were added to the development time. And I'll explain what this little blip is here later in the talk, but 14 years, it added 10 years to development time. People quite literally died waiting for these drugs, and that had some major effects. So one of the effects was in Britain and Europe, they got new drugs before the United States did. Now, of course, they had slightly more side effects, right? Because some of the drugs they got didn't go through a more elaborate process, so there were a few more side effects. But breakthrough drugs like propranolol lagged about 3 years behind the time that the Britons got them. And there were studies done that an estimated 30,000 Americans died prematurely because this drug did not come to the US market for 3 years. Now, this drug wasn't the best drug in the world, but it did help people with angina and hypertension. And the problem is that when it did come to the US, it wasn't approved for angina and hypertension, which were its major indications. So a drug can be approved for a particular indication and not for others. Doctors can still prescribe it. They do it what we call off-label. But unless the doctors knew about the great results in Europe, they probably weren't prescribing it until the FDA finally approved it for angina in 1973 and hypertension in 1976. So at this time, while all this was happening, there were more studies on the life-saving effects of the new drugs that were coming out, outweighing the risk factors. So for every life saved by these amendments, people were reporting about 338 lives lost because Americans didn't have access to these drugs. And in fact, I was working on AIDS drugs in the 80s, and the AIDS patients, they said, hey, we can't wait 14 years for new drugs. We need them now. So what they did is they hired black market chemists to make the same drugs we were working on at Upjohn and other companies, and they distributed them throughout the whole AIDS community. And actually, they did a pretty good job. The doctors that they worked with made sure they told the patients, hey, this is what we know and what we don't know about these drugs. And of course, the AIDS patients didn't have a lot of options. So they took some of these drugs. Some of them worked better than others, obviously. And many of them came from Europe because Europe was getting the drugs before we were. So anyhow, if you want to learn more about this, I recommend the award-winning movie, The Dallas Buyers Club. Matthew McConaughey was in it. It kind of goes into what happened to some of the people who tried to distribute these things to the AIDS community. And what happened in California was not much because the FDA knew that the California AIDS patients were very well connected to the media, and they didn't want to be the ones having fingers pointed at them for killing AIDS patients. So they basically left them alone. But in Texas, things were different. And that's what the Dallas Buyers Club is about. And it's an enjoyable movie. It'll, get some information while learning about what really happened to those poor AIDS patients who didn't have the protection of the media. Okay, so a lot of people died waiting that would have lived if they had these new drugs coming out. Now, I know this group here is very much into prevention. I am too, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. But for some people, drugs can be life-saving, and this has been measured. And I kind of put some data up here for you to see, but basically the bottom line here is that about 15 million people, estimated, of course, we can't be perfectly sure this is the right number, but 15 million people roughly died waiting from 1963 to 1999 because of the delay in the amendments. And I've broken it down by decade because, as you saw in the other slide, the wait time changed from decade to decade. And the number I used to make this calculation, and this is only for new chemical entities. I have to mention to you, and I should have when I had the other slide up, all these numbers that I'm showing you are for new chemical entities. In other words, a truly new drug, not a drug that's changed from the intravenous formulation to the oral formulation. These are for truly new drugs. And these drugs were the ones from 1970 to 1991. And I was actually surprised about how many people it was claimed that drugs saved. So I actually went back to the data and found out that most of these saves were in the cardiovascular area. They took out the number that they felt was helped by surgery. They took out the number that they felt was helped by lifestyle changes. And what was left, of course, was the impact of the drugs. And that's one of the ways in which this is calculated, not the only way. I believe, and I can't show you numbers on this, this is my personal opinion, that drugs put on the market after 91 were not as good as the ones before. And we'll get in a little bit to why that's probably true in a little bit later in my talk. But, drugs can save lives. They're not perfect. They have side effects. They can kill too. And of course, it's the risk-benefit ratio that we have to be concerned about. Okay, now you might figure out that if we went from 4 years of development to 14 years of development, we're going to have more costs. Of course, you would be right. It doesn't take a scientist to know that, right? It's obvious. So on this slide, what I've done is I've plotted the research and development in millions of $217. And that's the dark squares you see are the post-amendment numbers. These are from Tufts. There's been some dispute if these are right. We'll talk about that in just a second. And you can see it's exponential. You remember I told you in the beginning that the regulations kind of metastasize? Well, and the reason this is happening, remember, some drug executive has to sign on the dotted line that they support this approval, and they're on the hot seat if Congress gets all upset because people are calling in about side effects. So they keep adding more and more studies so that they can go to Congress and say, well, we made sure these guys did this study and that study and this study and that study. And who would have known that this would happen? And so they have some justifiable deniability. These are out-of-pocket expenses. And we'll talk about, for those of you who know about economics, we'll talk about capitalized costs in a minute. So this is what happened after the amendments. The costs soared. This point here represents $1.4 billion per new chemical entity in out-of-pocket costs. These are actual outlays that the pharmaceutical company makes. Down here in these open squares, we have some estimates of what it costs to get a drug on the market prior to the amendments. And if you extrapolate from there, which, okay, this is not, this is a long time. It's hard to really say this would have happened, but This is, a guesstimate of what costs would have been had we not had the amendments. So it would probably be more around here instead of way up there. It would have gone up. You can see it's going up. It just probably wouldn't have gone up that much. Okay, so I want to say a few things about these costs. The numbers have been disputed. The reason I used the numbers on the last slide that I did was because the Tufts numbers have the same methodology. That whole curve, same methodology. We do not have any other estimates that I'm aware of where the same methodology has been used for those decades. So the trend is right. Maybe the number is a little too high or low. I personally think it's a little low. And we'll talk about this. I mean, there's been a lot of people who say, oh, no, it doesn't cost that much. We tracked the cost of getting this particular drug to market. But what they don't realize is that 80% of that cost are the failures that precede the 20% successes. And so, in other words, you have to, if you track one drug, you have to multiply that number by 5 in order to really get a pretty good handle on the average cost of getting a new chemical entity to market. Also, most of these cost estimates that we hear from Public Citizen and things like that, they don't include the failures. And they don't include phase 4 studies, post-marketing studies. So when the drug gets an approval, sometimes the FDA says this approval is contingent on you doing some extra studies. And then, of course, the company is supposed to do those phase 4 studies, sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. And that depends on whether or not the FDA really gets on their case or not. Now, I told you I would talk about capitalized costs. I think the easiest way for a person who's not an economics person to understand this is, if you go out and buy a home and you get a mortgage and you're paying $100,000 for your house, over the time of that mortgage, you might actually pay out $200,000 because you got to pay interest too, right? Same thing with drugs. And so what economics people do when they see a 14-year development time is they kind of make that calculation. What would the interest be on a loan if the company had to get it? And so those out-of-pocket costs of $1.4 billion per new chemical entity that I showed you doubles if you capitalize them, roughly doubles. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. And we're going to see a capitalized graph in a little while, which is why I'm telling you this. Okay, now the problems with the high costs. I told you earlier, patents are needed to pay for FDA approvals now. It's almost impossible to recover your cost without them. I prefer not to have them. I mean, I have several patents that I got with the Upjohn company and one I got without. But, if you want to get anything developed today, you have to have a patent. And part of the reason is only 2 out of 3 out of 10 drugs recover their approval costs, which means that the entire industry has had to make some big changes. And one of the big changes it makes, it doesn't work on drugs that you take once or twice and then put back on the shelf. They are focusing on lifetime treatment, diabetes, hypertension, diseases where they can sell a drug for your whole lifetime. And the reason is that's the only way they can make costs. In fact, the whole industry is built on blockbuster drugs. They're the ones that are paying these extra costs for these, 7 to 8 drugs that don't make back their approvals. And chronic drugs, lifetime drugs, are more dangerous because your body can handle taking a drug and detoxifying it 1 or 2 times much more easily than it can if you take it every day for decades. The body gets tired, problems happen. Okay, so with all of this going on, what you might imagine is that we had a lot of less new drugs than we did in the past, and you'd be right. So what you're seeing here now is in these blue lines, you are seeing the actual number of new chemical entities. You see there's a little bouncing around that companies did from 1948 to 1962. And what you see in the red is the modeling of this. And you see it's pretty good, right? So when this modeling process was used for post-1962, what we should have seen was something like this red line. Instead, what we actually saw was the blue line. In other words, there's a great decrease, probably greater than 50% of new drugs that came out. And what this meant is the industry was hurting, and it created other problems, and more regulatory band-aids were put on this. And I'm not going to get into it in this talk. It's too much. But what you saw on that last slide was loss of innovation. And there's been a lot of studies done on this to try to predict how many drugs were lost. And the working number is 50% late stage dropouts, which means that the drug company gets 3/4 of the way through the drug development process and then realizes that the costs of getting the last 25% through doesn't make any sense, because the drug isn't going to make much money in the market because, like, a competitor has a better drug that came out, or, you know, whatever. There's a lot of reasons. But early stage loss is probably even bigger than that. And I'm going to tell you a personal story about that. So, as I said, I do have some patents. So one day I get a call from the FDA, and they say, Dr. Ruwart, we understand that you have submitted a patent application for prostaglandins and liver disease. I said, yes, that's true. They said, we are so excited about your work. There is nothing to treat liver disease except bed rest, which doesn't work. And we want to do everything we can to help your company get this drug on the market and save lives. Oh, I was thrilled. I was young and naive. I didn't know any better. I thought that this would actually make a difference in getting drugs to market. And frankly, at that point in time, my first reaction to being at a drug company was, how does anything ever get out the door? There's so much to do to get something out the door. How does it ever happen? So I was all excited. But the problem is this. When I talked to my management, they said, well, you know, the problem is that we don't know how to measure an improvement in liver disease easily. You know, the standard way to do it would be to take a biopsy, but you can't do a study with lots of people and like take a biopsy every month, at least not easily. I mean, these are sick people. And that means we had to guess about a lot of stuff. We had to guess what dose to give these people. We had to guess how often we had to give it. Once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day. How long we had to give it. 6 months, a year, 2 years, we didn't know. And if we guessed wrong on any one of those parameters, we would not get the statistical significance of p less than 0.05, and we would have to then redesign our study and start all over. And this study was going to take probably at least 3 years, probably longer. So when management and I talked this over, we realized that by the time we went through the animal studies we had to go through, the human studies we had to go through, if we didn't guess right the first time, we'd have to start over on the human studies, and the drug would be off patent by the time we got it to market, which meant, guess what? We couldn't recover our approval costs. So we did not develop that compound. And it's pretty sad, because there eventually were some human studies based on my work that happened in another drug company showing that, yes, the drug does work. Of course, they probably wouldn't market it for that because, again, they didn't probably want to go through the whole approval process. But I think they were trying to piggyback it onto maybe another indication. So don't know, haven't seen it. Somehow it got dropped. Okay. The point is this. Every time a new drug looks promising, management does this calculation. Is it going to be able to recover these huge approval costs? Which, of course, is at least in 2008, when this last point was put on that graph, was either 1.4 billion out of pocket or 2.8 billion capitalized. And the answer in most cases is no, unless it's a chronic treatment. And so there's a lot of early stage loss. So we probably have lost way more than 50% of our innovation. Why is this important? Because it doesn't matter how rich you are. If a discovery hasn't been made about a particular disease, about what works, you can't buy it for any price. So loss of innovation is literally a matter of life and death. And if you calculate based on this 50% number, rather than the bigger number, which probably is, I figure about let's say 27 million people died prematurely between the amendments and 2010. If you estimate that the lost drugs were only 25% as effective as current ones. And I'm being a little conservative here, but I also recognize that if you double the number of drugs you put on the market, you don't necessarily save twice as many lives. There is, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but you have to be careful that you don't make that assumption. And that's why I didn't. I said 25% is effective. Okay, let's continue on. So the amendments have shaved about 5 years off our lives if we consider the loss due to delays and the loss due to innovation. Yes, this is an estimate. This is the best I could do with the data that was available. And this loss ripples out into the world. It's not just happening in the US because the rest of the world tries to follow the United States now. Didn't back when the amendments were passed, but now they try to imitate the United States. So this continues to be bad news for everybody. Now, let's talk about the impact of the high cost of getting a drug to market versus what price you pay in the pharmacy. Again, this is for new drugs. So what we see here is the average cost of a branded prescription drug, which is basically what the NCE is. And then the R&D costs for the NCE. And this is the point, the pre-amendment point right here. And as you can see, after the amendments, for a while, things were kind of stable, and then they shot up. Whoa, and they're still going up today. Now, I want to point out that this would not have happened with the amendments. How do we know? Well, we know because there are, prior to the amendments, drug prices were dropping by about 30% per decade. Dropping, not growing, dropping. And of course, that's because as more and newer drugs came to market, and there was such great competition back then, pre-amendment, there were a lot of little drug companies, big drug companies, but there was a whole spectrum of drug companies, as we'll see in a minute. So if you assume that that graph is correct, then what you see is that had pre-amendment trends continued, pharmaceutical prices would probably be 5 to 10% of what they are today. And I did put one statistic in here. The drug prices did fall from about 32% from 49 to 61. So that's about 30% per decade. So they were falling, not increasing. Very important point. So these amendments also created the Big Pharma that we see today with all the warts that it has. Between 1955 and 62, the smallest 98% of the US drug firms put out 12% of the self-originated drugs, NCEs, okay? But in the 3 years after the amendments passed, they didn't produce any new drugs at all because all of this burden of regulation fell very heavily on them, especially the manufacturing. These are small companies, and they were actually much more efficient than the bigger companies. You have to realize that. That's what the studies show. It took a lot less personnel and money to put a drug on the market for the small companies because they were more efficient. I saw this at Upjohn. Upjohn was considered a medium-sized company, but I'm like, wait a minute, this management's top heavy here. They're just not very efficient getting a drug from the lab bench to the marketplace. And of course, Upjohn was nowhere near as big as the Pfizer and the big ones are today. So anyhow, of course, not surprisingly, by 1968, a lot of these small firms have gone out of business. So the number of firms producing new chemical entities was down by 44%. So by, as you can see from this, I should have put this over here in the beginning. By 1968, only 48 firms were producing new companies instead of the 108. And part of the reason was there was a lot of merging going on, because if you have a costly FDA approval process and the FDA says, no, we don't accept your drug, then of course, what happens? You have a big hit. And if you're a small company, you can't handle it. So you have to merge in order to make sure you can have a big enough company to take that hit. Also today, Big Pharma does, so what's happened? So what has happened over the years is now Big Pharma does almost all the development. The small startup firms actually do the research. When I was in the industry, every company had its own research. I mean, Upjohn prided itself on its research. That's not happening today, for the most part. For the most part. Now, the small companies have to license their drugs to Big Pharma because Big Pharma has the connections with the FDA. The little companies don't. They're new. And the FDA doesn't trust the new companies. They trust the big companies. Why? I don't. Well, I shouldn't say I don't know. I have some ideas, but I don't have data on it, so I won't say. I'll let you speculate. But so because of that, the little companies tend to have to almost sell out at a very low price to Big Pharma. There have been some exceptions. Some little companies have managed to get through the process, and I applaud them, but it's not typical. Okay. You know what? We might not care about the cost of drugs at the pharmacy or how long it takes to get them to market if the drugs were safer, right? But are they? After all of this, do the amendments which were passed to make drugs safer and more effective actually live up to what they want? Well, what they claimed they would be. And the answer is, as far as I can tell, no. Drugs are not safer for a number of reasons. So one way you can look at this is look at the withdrawal rate. So drugs get approved. Then some of them are found to have side effects, and they are taken off the market for safety reasons. Now, pre-amendment, there were about 2.5% of all the NCEs that were put out every year were withdrawn. So 2.5% of all the approved drugs have been pulled from the market pre-amendment. After the amendments, it was 3.3%. In other words, it went up. Well, probably not significantly. I want to be really clear. I'm not saying this is a big difference. It's probably not. But it's going in the wrong direction. This number was supposed to go down. That was the promise of the amendments. That has not happened. And another way of looking at this is look at the biggest drug disasters pre and post amendment. So thalidomide worldwide, and actually I've seen a lot of different numbers on this. I'm using the largest numbers that I saw. Okay, between 50,000 and 80,000 deformities, miscarriages, and deaths. I used to use the 10% or 10,000 number for the number of deformities. So most of these others are miscarriages and deaths, if these numbers are right. I have seen them. I haven't looked to validate them to make sure they're correct, but I'm using the high numbers just so you can kind of get a feel of how bad it might have been. Now, with Vioxx was put on the market after the amendments. And by the FDA's own admission, they think maybe 60,000 deaths and 140,000 heart attacks. But this is probably a really low estimate. Other estimates I've seen, which make more sense to me, is 1.3 million, because this drug was widely used. It was waited for a long time. It was widely used. But whatever these numbers were, Vioxx shouldn't have happened. And actually, the FDA knew that it was going to cause heart attacks before they approved it. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, other than the FDA not doing what it should, why do unsafe drugs get to market in the first place? How come, even after the amendments, we had significant numbers of bad drugs getting to market? Well, okay, in the 1950s, most of the problems, safety problems I'm talking about, were due to the fact that we just didn't have good enough science. And so we didn't predict reactions in specific populations. So for example, this didn't happen in the US, but it did happen in Europe. It wasn't widely appreciated that the fetus was so sensitive to drugs that the mother took, which were perfectly safe for her. So that's one thing. And actually today, it's pretty much the same thing. You know, we try to eliminate a lot of these things, but we can't, because we can't predict everything with animal safety studies or even human safety studies, because there's a big difference between doing a study with thousands of people and putting it on the market for millions to take. There's going to be some people who don't react well to every drug. It's just the way life is. At this stage of the game, we can't predict it. And it's interesting because while I'm telling you that the safety problems we see today, except for Vioxx, which I'll talk about in a minute, have similar issues, I also want to mention that there's this little glitchy thing going on with the way the studies are done. Remember, we talked earlier about the fact that you had to get statistical significance for drugs, and sometimes they can be statistically significant and clinically insignificant. And if you heard my other panelist on Sunday, Rob Whitaker, talking, and he's going to talk, I think it's this coming weekend, I'm sorry. He talked about how this is the case for psychiatric drugs. So I think that's actually right on from what I know, and I'm not an expert in that, so I'm going to defer to him. He's the expert. But this is another issue that's coming up, is that we have things that are not clinically significant but statistically significant, and some of these have some serious side effects. So there's a number of issues. Okay, now I told you I'd talk about Vioxx and what happened there, right? So remember this graph from earlier? This is the time it takes to develop a drug once you decide to develop it from the lab bench to the marketplace. And we saw that this number has gone up to 14 years in the 80s and 90s, but dropped in the 2000s, early 2000s. It dropped a year. Why? It's because we passed something called the 1992 Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So everyone was complaining because Europe was getting new drugs before we were. People were having to go to Europe to get them or died waiting. And so the FDA and the industry decided they would suggest this User Fee Act. Well, of those 14 years, only 2 of those were due to the FDA looking over the 12 years of data that the drug companies sent them. So it really, this act only gained a year for people who were dying waiting. But better than nothing. But there was a very high price that we're paying now for that. It started out that companies could pay an an optional $100,000 to the FDA to quickly review their data. And the reason the FDA was asking for this money was because they needed more people to review the data, so it wouldn't take so long. Today, it's a mandatory $3 million, well, I've got the number up there, $3,242,26. It's a lot of money. And in 2016, these user fees provided 72% of the total budget for the section of the FDA that approves drugs. So basically now, the industry has captured the FDA. They are paying the FDA's bills. And this is what's happened when you have regulation that is very stringent. This is not like a new phenomenon. This has happened in other industries as well. If the regulations are light, generally people accept them, they do their things, and all is well. When the regulations are stringent, there is what we call regulatory capture. And it happens, as I said, in a lot of industries. So the FDA knew Vioxx could cause heart attacks because David Graham, the examiner, said, hey, it causes heart attacks, went to his boss, and the boss told him, no, we're going to approve this drug because pharma is our client. Pharma is our client, not the American people, not Congress, pharma. So that's what happens with regulatory capture. And the regulatory capture happened because of the amendments driving up the time and cost of getting an FDA approval. This would never have been passed had the amendments, the 1962 amendments, been passed. It would also not have been passed if those amendments had been passed and the FDA had a more reasonable approach to regulation. The industry would not have had to do that. But with only recovering costs of 2 or 3 out of 10 drugs, this is what happens. And again, it's happened in many, many, many other industries. It's not just here. So I think this is not a sustainable situation. The industry is surviving only because of blockbuster drugs. And when the blockbusters stop and there's a few bad years, there's going to be some serious problems. But I've spent a lot of time showing you that there is a big problem with these amendments in terms of pharmaceuticals. And I'm estimating that we've lost 5 years of our lives to those problems. But this is the real biggie. Shifting our medical paradigm from prevention to treatment is what these amendments did, that I am estimating at least 5 years of our lives have added 5 years of our lives have been lost, and probably more. And I'm saying it this way because we don't have the studies, the level of studies that we have with the pharmaceutical industry that we can apply to prevention, unfortunately, not yet at least. So I have to tell you, it is my belief that this is even more serious than the drug material I've talked about. And I did that first because I knew I could get a number from the pharmaceutical industry. And doing that, I have to assume that prevention is at least as good as the drugs. I believe it's better. I believe that it's probably, we've lost about 10 years of our lives because we haven't had this. But I won't stand on that because I just don't have the data. But that's my personal opinion. Okay. So, and let me share some things about all this, and then I'll go into detail. So drug companies used to make a lot of nutritional products, or what we call alternative medicine. And I just showed a couple upjohn ones here. Kaopectate was a big seller. It's basically clay, an antidiarrheal, and then Unicap, and there were, of course, 1-a-day multiple vitamins, things like this. Okay, so these are just help you meet the minimum daily requirement. They don't optimize your nutrition. But the companies were very big in this prior to the amendments. And today, it's not well known, but most of the synthetic vitamins, vitamin C, when we make it synthetically rather than isolate it and things like that, vitamin E, they come still from the pharmaceutical companies. they're making those raw materials because they can make things on a big scale. That's what they do. So they still are very involved in this. It's just most people don't know that. For example, Upjohn was very involved in vitamin E. And anyhow, so I want you to know that. So you are aware that if pharmaceutical companies disappeared tomorrow, that a lot of our nutrient supplements would disappear as well. And that's not a good thing. So we just need to be aware. Okay. Now, why am I big on prevention? Well, back in the days when I was in research, we did not have the ability to manipulate our animals genetically. And you know, animals are smart. When I tried to give my rats alcoholic liver disease by feeding them alcohol, they refused to drink it. Even if all I did is, if the only water that I gave them was full of alcohol, they would thirst to death rather than drink it. Yeah, they're not dumb. Of course, when I put chocolate in there, that was a different story. Then they would drink it. But the thing I'm trying to get to is we had to play around with nutrition to get the models we wanted. And one of the things we did for something that looked like alcoholic cirrhosis, for example, was to take the choline, which is a B vitamin, out of their diet or put very low levels. And so what happened is we got a model that looked very much like human alcoholic liver disease by taking the choline out. Right. What does that mean? It means probably if you take enough choline with your alcohol, you probably will lower your chances of damaging your liver or damage it less. I'm not recommending drinking enough to damage your liver, but I'm just telling you that if you do drink, you know, taking choline is probably a good thing. It's a B vitamin. You can get it. You can get it in various ways too. So that's what we did. And so, of course, the research scientists that were doing this put this all together and go, okay, so optimal nutrition can help you fight off environmental stresses and probably a lot of other disease too. So we were taking care of our diets, we were supplementing, we were exercising, staying in good weight. And the medical doctors who were doing the clinical studies still smoked and drank. And I mean, it was really interesting. Of course, it wasn't totally true. There were some doctors who were smart enough to do what we were doing, but I just found that interesting. So yes, I'm big on prevention. I've actually been on supplements since grad school, and I won't be stopping anytime soon. Okay, but here's what happened after the amendments. Remember, I told you we needed patents, right? So we had some interesting problems that rose. I was on an airplane once, and the guy next to me, when he found out that I worked at Upjohn, he said, "Oh, I'm so glad to connect with you." He said, "I have this disease that I think could use a drug your company's working on, the lazeroids." They were so called because no matter what disease we gave them to, they seemed to really help our rats. So he said, "Can you get me some lazeroids? I don't think I have a whole lot of time." I said, "Well, I don't think so, but I will ask." So I went to the person who was in charge of the lazeroid development. And he said, "No, we really can't give him any." So he said, "But just tell him to take lots of vitamin E. It'll do the same thing." So why are we developing lazeroids when people could just take vitamin E? Well, the reason is pretty clear. Vitamin E, we can't advertise it for helping people with disease without going through this FDA development process and getting an FDA approval to advertise vitamin E for that. Doesn't matter if it works. We can't do it. It's against the law. The FDA will come down on us and give us a hard time. That's terrible, but that's what's happening. Also, there are side effects of certain drugs that are helped by nutrients. For example, a lot of people are on statins, but the doctors who are in the know today always recommend that their patients also take coenzyme Q because statins deplete it in in the metabolism or the way that the body breaks down statins. And that gives you leg cramps and leg weakness and muscle problems, all kinds of things. But if you take coenzyme Q with it, that relieves some of the problems. By the way, statins are widely used, and there are studies that show they work, but they don't work by lowering cholesterol. It's kind of one of those secrets in the industry. So statins don't work by lowering cholesterol. They're anti-inflammatory to some extent. And as most of you know, I'm sure, inflammation is the bad guy here in trying to stay alive and have a good life. So anti-inflammatories are good things. Okay, moving on, I want to talk about folic acid. It's another B vitamin. It's a B vitamin that if women take during their pregnancies, they can prevent a lot of what we call neural tube defects like spina bifida, which basically are malformations that usually require the children to be institutionalized. It's very sad. And taking folic acid prevents that. In fact, these spina bifida, these other things are just as bad as the thalidomide deformities, if not worse than we saw with thalidomide, right? So taking folic acid is a great thing. And so, of course, the folic acid manufacturers wanted to advertise that this product, a B vitamin, would help young women who were not yet pregnant, because you had to have it, in the first months of pregnancy, that would help them prevent these birth defects. And the FDA said, oh, if you do that, we're going to come after you. So they couldn't advertise. Meanwhile, over in Europe, their governments are paying money to advertise to women and telling them, hey, take folic acid so you don't have a problem. And even the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, started recommending for women to take folic acid. And the FDA said to the folic manufacturers, if you advertise and talk about the CDC's recommendation, we'll shut you down. So here in the US, most women did not hear about folic acid for several years. And it created what I call the American thalidomide. We had probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 babies who were born deformed or were purposely aborted, because you can check for some of these defects in utero. They were totally preventable if the FDA would have allowed the advertising. But it doesn't, because the folic acid manufacturers haven't gone through this very expensive regulatory process so that they can claim efficacy, they can claim effectiveness of folic acid in neural tube defects. Now, what the FDA has done is it started saying that grain manufacturers have to put folic acid in their grains. But that's really inefficient. A lot of women aren't going to be eating those grains. And if they do, are they getting enough folic acid? There's been studies showing that was pretty ineffective. So, of course, today, doctors do try to get their women patients to take folic acid. Usually it's not folic acid itself, it's a form of folate. But in order to make sure that if they get pregnant, they won't have babies that are deformed, when that whole thing could have been prevented. Also, fish oil. So this is one that's especially near and dear to my heart. I entered the Upjohn Company because they were the leading experts of the time in the industry in prostaglandin research. Prostaglandins and their metabolites today are known as eicosanoids. And if you take fish oil, you are taking the building blocks for the anti-inflammatory eicosanoids. There are inflammatory ones and anti-inflammatory ones, so there's this balancing act that they do. And of course, some drug companies realized that this was such an important nutrient that they wanted to make a drug out of it. So they put a little extra, I think it was a methyl group, onto the fish oil. And when you take that prescription fish oil, they actually jumped through the FDA hoops on this one because they thought it was that good. Once you take this prescription fish oil, the little methyl group comes off, and you get to I think it was a methyl group that they put on, some chemical group there that falls off. So you get fish oil, prescription fish oil. Well, that's all great, but my sister is diabetic, so she went and priced out what she was paying for her current fish oil from a supplement company and it was a high quality supplement, to the prescription fish oil. And what she found is her copay was equal to what she would have paid with the supplement company. Of course, she's paying a copay. Her insurance company is probably paying several times that. So now we've made fish oil expensive. And even though many doctors know fish oil is great, they won't recommend fish oil to their patients. They will recommend this pharmaceutical drug that costs many times more. And it's not as clean either. And by clean, I mean, fish oil has a lot of contaminants, and that's why you should probably think about molecularly distilled fish oil to get those things out. And in fact, there's fish oil on the market that is cleaner than this prescription fish oil. And that would come from the Zone Diet people, zonediet.com. Barry Sears, who hired a chemist from Britain to make sure his fish oil was the best on the market. So a little thing on that. And again, without jumping through those hoops, doctors cannot tell their patients. Well, doctors can tell their patients because they can't. The pharmaceutical companies or the nutraceutical companies, the supplement companies, they cannot tell patients that their fish oil is going to do all those things the prescription fish oil does, simply because they haven't jumped through all those hoops. And, stem cell research. Okay, this is a biggie. Stem cells are, they're the new frontier of really great medicine. And what some doctors had been doing, of course, is taking stem cells out of their patients and injecting them into they take them from the blood, they inject them like into their knees or joints to help them heal. And what happened was one doctor, and especially, realized that his older patients needed more stem cells. So in that case, what he did was he grew them up for a while and for a few days and then put them back into the patient and got better results. But the FDA said, no, you can't do that. It's okay if you take them out and inject them back in one day. But if you grow them in a petri dish or test tube or whatever and then put them back, no, now they are drugs. And you must jump through our regulatory hoops if you want to give your patients more stem cells after you've grown them up. So, of course, he moved that part of his operation offshore. And so now only if you have the money to go offshore can you get a better product. And this is really crazy because really stem cell treatment is a lot cheaper than knee replacement. So this is another way in which our healthcare costs are hiked up in the medical sector because doctors are not allowed to do the best procedure because the FDA has overstepped. And then there have been a lot of publications saying that doubling vitamin D levels should add some time to our lives. The estimate I saw was 2 years. And interestingly enough, during the COVID crisis, the patients who survived best were the ones with high vitamin D levels. And I could talk a little bit about this patents and radiation cream, but I'm going to skip that because I want to make sure I get through my talk pretty much on time. I'm going to running just a bit late. Okay, so thalidomide takes us back to the future. Thalidomide is now on the market, or I should maybe say analogs of thalidomide with the same problems as thalidomide are back on the market. And it's treating leprosy, cancers, testing it for inflammatory disease and transplantation. So I just want to leave you with a thought that every drug maybe not every drug, but most drugs, let's say, have some good uses. And they may have some bad side effects too. So it's kind of a mixed bag. You have to get it for the right thing. I just thought I'd mention that because most people don't know about it. Okay, so here's my conclusion. Side effects of regulation can be just as deadly and often more widespread than side effects from pharmaceutical drugs. I know that's not something most of us think about. We think about it protecting us, but in many, many cases, and I would say almost every case, if not every case, this is true, because what regulation does is it makes the decision for you instead of letting you make the decision with your doctor. So I know that's something near and dear to most of your hearts. So whether we are regulators, this is good news, by the way. It doesn't sound like it at first, but whether we are regulators, pharmaceutical executives, elected officials, or the public, our lives and those of our loved ones have been shortened by the amendments. Why is that good? Because when people wake up and realize that they're affected by these things, I think they'll want the change. The change to go back to something, excuse me, more reasonable. And that's a good thing because it gives us hope. So, right to try was passed to give us that hope. But it's got a problem. And excuse me. I have something in my throat I'm being treated for. It's not totally taken effect yet. Okay, so FDA approval is still needed to market a right to try drug. So companies are scared to let someone who approaches them for their drug, let them have the right to try, because the FDA might not look favorably on that. And if they slow down their approval process for their next drug, it's not going to help them. It's going to hurt them greatly. And there's nothing they can do about it because they have no legal recourse. So there have been, though, some, remember we talked about the FDA can't be sued. So in some states, it's had minimal impact. There have been, I'm so glad to be able to say that there have been bold companies and doctors who have still gone ahead and utilized right to try. And right to try, I should have maybe explained it. I just assumed you all knew what it was. That's not a good assumption. Right to try was passed recently. And what it does is it says that even if the drug is not approved by the FDA, you can go to the drug company and request it. And if they agree, you can try it. And the FDA has fought this for years. They've had a compassionate use program, and what they do is they deny people until the very end when the drug is no longer useful. Then they allow them to take it. And then they can say, oh, yeah, we approve almost every compassionate use. Yeah, which is really, really not true. In fact, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Now, there's another program that's been suggested. Heartland's Free to Choose Medicine doesn't have that particular Achilles heel. You can go to heartland.org to learn more about it. It really establishes a second track for drugs after they've gone through the safety testing in humans and one small study that looks kind of like both at safety and effectiveness at a very low level, not the elaborate ones I talked about before. So the problem is, of course, it still requires some FDA involvement. But once the company has done these particular studies, then it can go into this free to choose medicine track where it never has to be approved. So it creates a second track, and then people can decide, yes, I'll wait for the FDA approval, or no, I won't. And that gives us a little more freedom. Not perfect freedom, but a little more. So I'm going to talk about certification a little bit. It's another way, instead of regulation, to protect us from bad drugs. Underwriters Laboratory does this for electrical equipment. If you see the little UL on the electrical equipment, what that means is underwriters have looked at it. They've given it their seal of approval. But there's no law that says you can't buy something that's electrical that doesn't have that seal. Now, it's true most stores want to have the UL seal in their shop, but you can buy something that an electrician makes and you don't have to have that seal. And so that's why it's so nice, because you have the final choice as a consumer. And before the amendment happened, there were actually third-party certification of drugs. And these, I've listed some here. And they either tested them themselves, or they looked at all the research and either gave them the seal of approval or didn't. Physicians and pharmacists who actually used the reports who actually used the drugs, wrote reports and published them in medical journals. And there were even sources for the layperson, like the General Federation of Women's Club, that wrote articles for the consumer to understand. And this is a much better way than regulation, because regulation takes the choice away from you. Certification gives you the choice. And the nice thing is you can get multiple, check multiple certifiers and see what they say. It's kind of like the reviews on Amazon, just like you can get different reviews on Amazon, you get different certification people. And if they're all saying it's great, then, that gives you a pretty good idea. And there are some post-amendment examples. In fact, the Abigail Alliance, which was started when the FDA refused Abigail, a lady who was dying of a particular cancer. There was a cancer drug in trials that was showing great promise in her types of cancer. FDA did not allow it to her till the last minute. Her father started the Abigail Alliance to track what the FDA was doing with cancer drugs, and the Abigail Alliance has recommended that 40 cancer drugs be approved, and the average was 2 years before the FDA's approval. Public Citizens has the other end of the spectrum. They report on dangerous drugs, and they've reported on these dangers for 11 out of 20 dangerous drugs, an average of 3.3 years before the FDA withdrew them. And then the Life Extension Foundation reviews a lot of drugs that are, life extending or, work in disease. And by the way, the FDA tried to jail its founders for bringing coenzyme Q10 into the market. This is the nutrient that you take with statins to help alleviate those side effects. And I highly recommend their products and their analysis. And you can find that at lifeextension.com. They have a monthly magazine and really great place. So if we have, but the bottom line of this slide is if we have lay people who are able to do these things, and do them pretty well, think about what kind of certification we could have, not just with them, but with, professionals who are dedicated to really teasing out all the problems and the benefits of drugs. So this certification is very doable. And so my recommendation are to repeal the amendments and maybe even disband the FDA. It's shown itself to be very unethical. It's not going to be helped by just putting a new head of the FDA, and the whole scheme is really problematic. We could talk about that a little more if you want. If the FDA remains, make it a certifying agency. It can make recommendations. If you don't like them, you don't have to listen to them, because the companies won't need to have an FDA approval for their drug. Of course, if they put something horrible on the market, they can be sued. They'll be liable. The thing is that the FDA approval really lowers the ability of someone to go in and really come after somebody for a drug liability. So this is another downside of the regulations. And the market is going to demand that we have a lot more certifiers. Competition is really the name of the game. And competition is what these regulations have taken away from us. I know my colleagues on the panel on Sunday were talking about how this is all capitalism at work. No, this is not capitalism. Capitalism is when the government does not interfere with the marketplace. And what we have is the government, the FDA, really interfering to such an extent that the industry has to capture the agency to survive. That's what we really have. And it's not capitalism, not the free market. I don't like the word capitalism as much, but it's not the free market. The market is regulated best by competition, and that's what the FDA took away from us. It killed the small drug manufacturers. It created this big pharma monolith, and it's the cartel, I guess, is really a better word for it, and really denied us quick access to good drugs and puts the bad ones on the market for the industry. It's just nuts. Okay. The idea, if you want to destroy big pharma, the best way to do it is to have competitors. And we've got to open it back up and stop the regulations that basically are making the marketplace very small, and encouraging the consolidation of the industry and merging of the industry. If we don't do that, Big Pharma will always be with us with all of the problems, the ethical problems that we see today. Competitive market is the strongest regulator of all because it lets you, the consumer, make the choices. Okay, so hopefully, let's go back to one of the first slides I showed you. I told you what I was going to explain. I hope I have. I tried to explain how the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug Act have indirectly made patents mandatory for FDA approval, how it created the Big Pharma cartel, shifted our medical paradigm from prevention to treatment, shaved 5 to 10 years off each of our lives. Of course, that's a conservative estimate, and how we can reverse these changes to reclaim the golden age of health that should have been ours. And we are poised on that today. We could still have it happen for us, but we have to change what we're doing with the regulators. So I have gone into more detail in my book, Death by Regulation, an Amazon bestseller in the US, Germany, and Canada. It's been endorsed by Ron Paul, Foster Gamble, and Dr. Jonathan Wright. If you want to get a copy, of course, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it through my website. You can contact me through my website. And you can also email me at mary@ruwart.com, my first name at my last name.com. I don't put it up on the screen because I get so much spam. I want to stop it. But feel free to always put in the subject line if you email me, please. Heard your talk, the truth about health. Or heard you in a talk, have a question, something, so I don't think you're spam. And I want to thank you for paying attention to me for so long. And I hope you will ask what other questions you have, and I will try to answer. And if I don't know, I will tell you that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that very informative and thorough presentation. That was a lot of really great information. Definitely gives me a new perspective on this issue. So we're going to begin the Q&A just for the audience sake, so they know how we work. We don't take questions directly from the chat. What we do is we ask you to raise your hand in Zoom. In order to do so, you need to go to the second from the right button called Reactions at the bottom of the Zoom window, and then you click on Raise Your Hand. When I call on you, I'll just ask you where you're from and just state your question. And we just ask that your questions are brief and on topic. And with that, I'm going to ask the first question. Sure. Is there any political will to make these changes happen?
Yes, there is. That's why we had Right to Try, for example. It started as a state-by-state action, and then it really got its teeth when Trump said that he would be happy to sign a Right to Try bill. So that was great. What he thought he was signing, of course, was something that really was going to open up choice to everyone. And because of the way the FDA works with the pharmaceutical companies and can choose winners and losers, obviously that hasn't happened the way that we imagined it would. The thing is, I think the people here may be some of the most likely to get excited about another approach, because if you're taking supplements or into the preventative movement in any way, and I know a lot of your listeners are, you already know that the FDA is not your friend in terms of helping you get the best health. And now you know how it got its teeth. Now you know how it's warped the pharmaceutical industry, which actually can be quite helpful when it's competitive. And I think the people here may want to help in that movement. I certainly hope so. And I think connecting with the life extension people is one really good way to kind of get in the movement. They often send out like letters to your congressman and things like that. There's many others in the movement too. So yes, there's definitely a push to it. The thing is, most people don't understand the mechanics of this, and that's why I'm talking to you today. Because if we don't understand that, we can't fix it.
Great, thank you. And with the Right to Try, so I understand that would make it easier for companies to bring about, and scientists to bring about new drugs to the market. how would we ensure safety, even using marketplace mechanics? Would we be able, if someone put a new drug out there under right to try, and it kills a bunch of people, could those people be sued? Could they go to jail? Like what mechanisms would there be to ensure safety?
Okay, so in right to try is a little different. Right to try, you actually understand that you're taking the drug at your own risk. It hasn't been FDA approved. What are the limits of that? Well, the limits are probably fraud. In other words, if you take a drug and the company knows that it's got a 50% chance of killing you, well, of course, it wouldn't give it to you, but let's just give kind of an example we can hang our hat on. So, and you find out that they knew that 50% of the people who took it would die, then you could sue them. But if they've told you everything they know about the drug, given you informed consent, basically, then obviously, and you say, okay, I still want to take it, then that's up to you. The problem, though, isn't that, because the company's not going to give you the drug if they don't have some feel that it's pretty safe for you. But what they do is most people who want to take right to try are terminal. Mm. What happens is if the drug doesn't work, they're going to die. The company already knows that if they die on the drug, the FDA may turn around and say, oh, well, it might have been your drug. So now you have to do all these extra studies, And so this is one of the reasons the companies don't want to do it. The reason I know this is we had a situation, several actually at Upjohn, where people wanted compassionate use. And the first part of that is we have to agree. Whether the FDA agrees is a whole other situation. And these are the kind of discussions we had. Do we want to risk a drug that may save lots of lives and get it delayed because we give it to one person who's going to maybe die, but not because of our drug?
Okay, thank you. And in your book, you've got a chapter called "Expensive Drugs Are Now Replacing Affordable," or you say that expensive drugs are now replacing affordable natural products. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, that was that one slide, where I talked about the fish oil, for example. And there's actually the folic acid, of course, is still cheap, which is good. But the really good drugs are being turned into, well, actually, there's several nutrients, I should say. For example, NAC, they tried to ban that during COVID. It was actually, and part of the rationale was that that some drug company was working on it. And that's another little twist that I didn't get a chance to talk about. But if a drug company is working on either that compound or more likely an analog of it, which means they put an extra chemical group on it that might come off when you take it, then the FDA says that it's a drug, so you, the consumer, can no longer buy it over the counter. And they're starting to do that to a bunch of drugs, a bunch of nutrients, so they're trying to. And so what will happen if that continues is that the companies will turn these nutrients into expensive products, just like they did with fish oil.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I know it's not well known. I'm trying to remember the name of the association that watches this most closely. It's the abbreviation is the ANH. National Health. It'll come to me. I'll think of it and send it to you. Then you can post it.
I'll think of it as soon as this is over. Yes. So we've got a couple of hands out there. So let me go ahead and call on a couple of our audience people. Stephen, where are you from, and what's your question?
I am in Iowa, and really appreciate this presentation. It lifted the veil of some things. Not sure I wanted to know all that was behind it, but it makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate, Michael, your first question about the political will, and I want to follow that up. I mean, are there leading advocates in Congress or among presidential candidates for whom this is an actual issue?
Well, that's a good question. My guess is that the closest person that I am aware of would probably be Rand Paul. And that's partly because his father, Ron Paul, endorsed the book. So I know Ron Paul. I have met Rand, but he probably doesn't remember me. So I guess he would probably realize it. Frankly, I think if this came up in Congress, if somebody would just start talking about it, there would be a lot of buy-in. And there would also be a lot of pushback. I have written several articles and made several presentations before I wrote this book. I actually presented the FDA. The higher ups are really pretty much aware that, okay, this was back in the 90s, and this is an important thing because things change. So back in the 90s, the people that were in the FDA, they were well aware that delays kill people. But of course, their neck was on the line, their job was on the line. So that really deterred them from changing things. There was one guy in there who was doing cancer patients, making cancer drugs really hard to get approvals. Then his wife got cancer, and he found out how hard it was to even get her in a clinical trial, and he changed his whole way of doing things. But the system is so entrenched. This is why I think you really have to get rid of the agency. The system is so entrenched. Even when he wanted to push drugs through quickly in his section, and he was like the head of his section, he was only able to save a year. The whole system is screwed up. I mean, the whole agency, there's no way to fix it, I don't think. I think you really have to get rid of it.
And to follow up on that, given that the pharmaceutical industries are so incredibly profitable, the ones that now exist, obviously all the small ones are gone based on what you were saying. What is the likelihood that that this would be able to get passed, given the power and the influence of the pharmaceutical industry on on the legislature and on the FDA?
Yeah, they aren't going to want this, but it's going to have to be the people who stand up. And actually, there were times in the 80s where FDA tried to regulate nutrients just like drugs, and they got the most pushback. Congress got the most pushback from the public than they ever had gotten, both times. This is what we need to do. I mean, we're going to have to be the people who push it. Yes, we can get Congress people to help and support us, but the reality is the only way this is going to happen is through the people, I fear, because there's more of us than there is of them.
Okay, let me go to our next audience question. Steve, where are you from?
Hi, Steve from New York. This seems to be across the board. The agricultural regulators protect industry. The banks are failing because they were unregulated, and in Europe, the regulatory agencies protect the people, and in this country, the regulatory agencies seem to protect the industries that they're under the guise of protecting the public, and that seems to be capitalism at its worst.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
How do we fix this?
Okay, it's a great question. I actually can answer it, Steve. Yeah, it's not really capitalism, because what's happening now is the government is taking the taxpayer money to bail out the banks oftentimes. Now, what happened I have another book, Healing Our World, which I wrote before this one. It answers political questions like that. And one of the things it talks about is the Scottish free banking system. They didn't have many regulations there in Scotland, but this was towards the mid to late 1800s. And what they did is, if the bank went bankrupt, the owners were liable. And this is what normally has happened in many countries, not just in banking, but for other things. It used to be the owners were liable. But what we've done is the government has taken its sovereign immunity cloak and given it in part to corporations. When you incorporate so that if you harm somebody, you are only liable due to the amount of assets you have in the corporation. The owners are not liable. So the owners don't pay really good attention to liability issues, except to the extent that they want, their stock to go up. So if harming people will make money and they can get away with it, then they're fine with that. And see, the banks in Scotland didn't do that. If the banks went bankrupt, the owners were liable. And if the owners couldn't pay, the other banks said, oh, this is going to be bad for for our publicity. No one's going to want to put money in banks if, you can lose your money. So what they did is they actually made good on those deposits that the owners could not, to keep the industry solvent. And so that's the way it should work in a true free market or capitalistic system, is that, of course, you have to be responsible for what you do. And if you lose the monies that you've promised that your depositors would be there when they needed it, then you have to pay up. And so that's really the way it should work. We should not have this protection for the corporations, in my opinion. The whole stock market thing is set up in a way that the government can manipulate it at will through the Federal Reserve, which those kind of two work together. So the Federal Reserve can, or if the government wants to spend more, it can inflate the currency, which it's been doing. I mean, in fact, inflation has been so entrenched that we think it's natural. It's not. It's not. It should actually go the opposite way. Our dollar should buy more tomorrow than it does today. It buys less. I hope that helped.
Great, thank you. And so now in your book, you talk about the FDA rating stores and positions for promoting prevention. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Dr. Jonathan Wright, who's not only my colleague, but one of my doctors, who endorsed death by regulation, had his offices raided at gunpoint, and because the FDA was presuming that he had adulterated drugs. They went into his trash can and found that there were some vials of drugs that had, I don't know, discoloration, growth, something in them that they didn't like. That's why they were in the trash can. So he tried for a long time. They took all the records. They actually even held the patients at gunpoint. And they took all the records, and it took him years to get those records back. And then he had to pay to have them copied by the FDA. It's really atrocious. And life extension, same kind of thing. They raided their, I guess it was their offices, and took, all their computers. They took all their records, and they told the founders that they were going to see them jailed for life. Their lawyer said, "Yeah, you can't win against the FDA. You better just make a deal." And of course, they said, "No way." And they got on programs. It was radio programs at the time. The internet wasn't around much. So they got on the radio, and they talked about the nutrients, and they talked about the things that the FDA was doing to them. Really bad publicity for the FDA. And the FDA kept lowering their offer. Okay, instead of 20 counts, we'll only have 7 counts. Nope, they wouldn't take anything. They kept at them. Finally, the FDA had to dismiss all the charges, and in addition, they stopped the raids, I think, because of this. I can't be sure, but the raids did stop once the life extension people prevailed. So that was a real win for us, us meaning the public, because they raided health food stores as well while people were shopping. I mean, this was really bad. They were trying to discourage people from taking nutrients. And again, a lot of your people know that longevity is based on having a high level of nutrients and not eating junk food and not taking the minimum daily requirements of vitamins. We need much more than that. The FDA simply won't admit it.
So speaking about the dietary stuff. So you also in your book talk about how new dietary ingredient regulations are thwarting prevention. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, that's when I was talking about the fact that if the drug company is trying to make a drug out of a nutrient, either directly of the exact nutrient or a modification of it, the FDA claims that makes it a drug and it cannot be sold over the counter anymore.
Okay. And we've got about 2 to 3 more minutes left. So I just want to ask you, with the 3 minutes in mind. So with your expertise in healthcare policy, what do you see as the most pressing issue? I mean, I'm assuming that this is definitely up there, if not the most pressing issue to you. And how can we ensure that all individuals have access to high quality, affordable care?
Well, are you meaning just nutrient and pharmaceutical care, or or the whole global healthcare thing.
The whole, let's go wide. Well, for three, well, now we've got 2 minutes. So wherever you can get in 2 minutes, if you can hit the globe in 2 minutes, I'll give it to you.
Okay, let me tell you this. What I've talked about today is happening in healthcare in general. It's not just the pharmaceutical industry. The government has gotten so involved in healthcare as well. I want to let you guys know that. It pays about 50% of all the healthcare costs in the US. We do not have a free market in healthcare. I mean, the government's always pointing, oh, the marketplace failed. If you really look at it carefully, like I have, it's not. It's the other way around. I even remember, I'm old enough to remember a time when people did not get health insurance. They didn't need it. They could pay for it themselves. It was affordable. But that changed with Medicare and Medicaid. And Medicare got accepted by the doctors because they paid so well. Now they pay so little, so it's they got kind of trapped. So that I want to pass that on to you because that's an important thing for everyone to know. We do not have a free market in healthcare, and that's what's being blamed for this whole situation. And as long as we have this fallacy about what's happening, we can't fix it.
Okay. I hear a lot, we've got 1 more minute left. I think a lot of people out there, as opposed to blaming the free market, blame corruption. Is that, what are your thoughts on the role of corruption and also coming from the corporations? Because it's hard to see, especially with the revolving door, which you hit on in your presentation, where one ends and where another begins. So you talk about the FDA and the government, but these are the same people who are in the corporations, and that's capitalism, right? Or free market, right? In theory. How do you even begin to know as an FDA? And now you've got 30 seconds.
Well, corruption. Okay, so if most other countries have a saying, where there's regulation, there's corruption. We don't have it, but they call it the bite. And what they mean by that is it's a bribe. And as we saw, the FDA got right into the bribing business right after these amendments. This is what happens. People have the idea that government's there to protect them. I have bad news. It's not. It's run by the people who have more power and money than you do. That's the truth of it. And as long as we have government and government can do things private citizens cannot, we're going to have corruption. That's the definition of corruption.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to end it there. Thank you so much, Mary, for this very enlightening conversation. It just adds on to all of the other stuff that we've learned as far as how things work. So thank you again. We really appreciate it. If we can unmute the audience, please. Do I have my my team unmuted?
Thank you, Mary.
Good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.